And what we said the last few times is that God creates evil. He creates evil as a necessary means to achieving a good, the good being the purpose of the whole creation. And that's the characteristic that all evil has. All evil is for the sake of contributing to the good. And if someone asks, but why do you call it necessary? You're talking about God, aren't you? Why would he need to use an evil means to achieve a good? Why couldn't he just skip the evil means and go straight to the good? We answer that question by pointing out that if you provide a description which is self-contradictory, you cannot use that description to ask a question. Why doesn't God do that? Because the self-contradictory description has no content. It has no meaning. It doesn't describe anything. It's like asking, why doesn't God blah? That's not a genuine question. And I showed you that the good that God has dedicated the creation to requires, on the basis of strict definition and logic, evil as a means, so that asking why God doesn't go to the end without the evil means is like asking why God doesn't make square circles, which is not a question. So we are left with this idea based on verses and based on the Mishnah that God creates evil and does so as a necessary means to the ultimate good. Now, having said that, the sources that we have describe this in, I would say, almost poetical terms to communicate this idea. There is a proposition in our literature which says, God does not identify his name with evil. Doesn't identify his name with evil. Let me show you where that comes from. Do we have a chumash here? Thank you. The very beginning of the creation, the 5th verse, reads, Vayikro Elokim La'or Yom, God called to the light day, V'lachoshech Kora Laila, to the darkness called night. It was evening and morning one day. So the rabbinic commentators explain, you have here a compound sentence. God called to the light day, and to the darkness he called night. But the subject, God, is only used once. It's only used for the first half of the sentence, that God called to the light day. Then it goes on as a compound predicate, and he called to the darkness night. That's true. But God's name is associated directly only with the first half of the sentence. Now the critic says, come on, Rabbi. John went to the store and bought milk and crackers. Who bought crackers? John bought crackers. Right? It's a compound predicate. It refers to the same subject. What do you mean his name is associated with the first half and not the second half? Well, to answer that question, you have to go back one verse. Now, that's a difficult job for some critics. The previous verse reads, God saw that the light was good, and God distinguished between the light and the darkness. There's a compound sentence where the subject is mentioned twice. It says God twice, not once. It's John went to the store and bought milk, and John bought crackers. So you'd at least have to ask why. In verse 4, the subject is mentioned twice, and in verse 5, it isn't. So then suppose someone says, look, Rabbi, mentioning the name twice is just a waste of a word, since you understand the sentence without it. So in verse 5, there's no problem. Verse 5 is working on the basis of economy. You have a problem with verse 4. Don't build something on what's written in verse 5. But that's not right. Because in verse 5, the verb is repeated. God called to the light day and called to the darkness night. If you're talking about economy, you could have skipped the second verb also. God called to the light day and to the darkness night. But since the verse doubles the verb, that means it is not working on an economy. So then you have to understand why it removes the second subject as it would have been in verse 4. That's where the rabbis are coming from. If you are used to snippets of rabbinic thought and being treated as a kind of imaginative fluff with no basis in precise thought, you should invest your time studying some of the rabbinic thought. Now, we're talking here about light and darkness. What's it got to do with good and evil? How do you get to good and evil? Well, I just read you verse 4. God saw that the light was good. So his relationship to the light is relation to something good. Now let's ask this. When God saw that the light was good, what else was on stage? What else was already in the context of discussion? Well, there was darkness and the deep, and the tovavo, the confused state of affairs, and light. Out of all of those, God saw that the light was good. That at very least implies that the other things aren't as good as the light. Otherwise, he would have said the light and ABC are good. So you have a real background in the precise reading of the words on the page, which leads to the rabbinic comment. The question is, what does rabbinic comment mean? What does it mean to identify your name with something and not to identify your name with something else? Let's suppose that A is trying to kill B. A is pursuing B to kill him. Now, in Jewish law, the rule for that case is, he's coming to kill you, kill him first. Kill him first. Now, imagine someone says, I don't see the difference. He wants to kill him and he kills him. It's just chaos. It's just Hobbes' state of nature, where it's all against all. Not really, because A was trying to kill B. B wasn't trying to kill anyone. A was trying to kill B. B was defending himself. They really aren't equal, even though they both had their fingers on the trigger, even though B pulled the trigger and killed A, they really aren't equal. B killed A as a means for saving his life. A was trying to kill B to get his land, for revenge, or for some other reason. It makes a big difference what your means are and what your ends are. Imagine someone who's totally unaware of surgery and he sees an amputation. What does he think is going on? Well, if it's Seattle, this is what you do to political opponents. You amputate their limbs. But no, he's saving his life. So the fact you see him cut off a leg doesn't tell you much. Depends on why he's cutting off the leg. What we're being told here is that God associates his name with his ends, with his goals, with the ultimate purpose of what's going on. Means are something which are temporary, which the world will outgrow. In the world to come, there are no means, only ends. Everything else, there's no evil in the world to come. All the evil that exists in our world is only a means to that end. So by saying that he associates his name with the light and the good, and he doesn't associate his name with evil, of course, on day one, he's the only agent. On day one, he's responsible for doing it, but he doesn't do it for the same purpose, and he doesn't do it in the same spirit, and that's what we're being told. The distinction between means and ends is a fundamental distinction that carries out throughout Jewish literature. Even when God creates both, we have to understand that one is means and one is ends. That's the one thing that Ramchal says here. And by the way, a former student of mine, a number of years ago, reminded me of something which I knew, but I didn't have it at the top of my mind the way I should. People ask, why did God create a world like this? A world in which there is sickness and there's oppression and there's accident, not to mention death and starvation and disease. Why did God create a world filled with so many evils? The simple, obvious answer to that question is he didn't. None of that applies to the Garden of Eden. None of it was there. Zero. He created a world with no death, with no disease, with no injury, with no war programmed in, no need to even work for your necessities. It was Guadalajara, the land of eternal spring, where you didn't need clothes. We created that world. Our failure brought about a world with all of those other ingredients in it. You could ask, hypothetically, why did God set up a system whereby if we fail, then the world goes from that ideal state that he created to the state that we're living in? That would be a legitimate question. But the question of creating it, he didn't create that world. That wasn't his purpose in creating the world, and it wasn't his preference. His preference was for the world of the Garden of Eden. Yeah.
We're actually discussing this a little bit today in Musser's lecture. We said that Adam Rishon was formed with Bechira, and then when he ate, he had the Bechira to choose whether or not he should eat the fruit. And when he did, that's when the Yitzhahara came into his.
Okay, first of all, let me translate what you said for everybody else, because they don't know what Yitzhahara is, they know what Bechira is, so you're using language which the other people can't understand. He was taught in another class that Adam was created and he had free will, but the evil inclination was external to him. And by eating from the tree of knowledge, he internalized the evil inclination. Now, although those words are written in various sources, they have to be understood with care. If you want to persuade someone to do something, or persuade someone that something is true, you've got to start where he is. If you don't start with something he agrees with, you will not succeed. You say, I want you to accept A. So listen, Q implies A. Q makes A true. And he says, yeah, but I don't think Q is true. You didn't make any progress. In order to persuade somebody of something, you've got to start where he is. You've got to say, look, you already want this, you already believe this, look at how the logic traces itself out to this conclusion. So it's not possible to understand that the whole impulse to evil was external to him, wasn't part of his nature, and by exercising free will, he internalized it, because under those conditions, if the whole impulse to evil was external, he couldn't have done any evil. When the snake talks, somebody's got to be listening, and as they use the modern jargon, it's got to resonate inside. It's got to be talking and say, oh, yeah, I hear that, and then struggle with your contradictory motivation. This is what I told you 3 weeks ago, that when God created a human being with soul and body, the purpose was to place him in a position of conflicting motivations. The soul is automatically motivated to the good, the right, the holy, the true, the beautiful, and the body is motivated to the physical. And that creates conflicts most of the time. Not always, but it creates conflicts most of the time. And then because of that conflict, the person can make a choice. So whatever it means by saying that the evil inclination was external, became internalized, it can't be the total picture. It can't be the total package. Now, we talked about this, again, a few weeks ago. One explanation, which Rav Dessler writes in detail, is this, that the ability to do a transgression deliberately, knowing it's wrong, and rebelling and doing it against, or doing it out of desire and knowing that you're transgressing, that he didn't have. But he did have the ability for another kind of failure, and the failure is the failure of rationalization. And what he did was to rationalize his action, and his moral and spiritual failure was to analyze his own motivation more objectively. He analyzed it in a certain way where he misrepresented to himself what his real motivation was, and that's what he's held responsible for. Then, after having eaten from the tree of knowledge, he internalized the Yetzer Hara that we're familiar with, which can deliberately, with full knowledge, rebel against the commandment. That he didn't have before. But he definitely had a failure which was able to produce a wrong action, because if he didn't have that failure of bad motivation, if he didn't have that, he wouldn't have been able to do it. And one mustn't oversimplify. Indeed, I have a motto: if you ask a Jewish question, you get a simple answer, it's wrong. I would say nothing's really simple. It's sort of similar to the physical world, As you know very well, probably, nothing's simple. And the least complicated elements are the most mysterious of all. The elementary particles, according to quantum mechanics, are very, very mysterious. They aren't just little pebbles banging around into the void like Democritus thought they would be. Didn't work out that way. Okay, so I think that's the idea. So the evil that's in the world is here, and it's here to be a means to the greater good. Now here I have to take issue with the translator, which I think he tried his best, but there were certain things that he put in very misleading ways. He writes, no bounds or limits can be placed on God's omnipotence. Okay, sort of. We talked about that in detail. And therefore, there is nothing preventing him from creating even evil if he so desires. Well, that's extremely misleading. Does he lack the power to produce evil? Not enough machinery, not enough CRISPR, not enough intellect. No, he doesn't lack the power. But that doesn't mean that it's possible for him to do it because of his character. He is, as we've said a dozen times, perfection. Perfection means absolute goodness. Absolute goodness will not produce evil. That is to say, evil that's not for the sake of good. So it makes it sound like since he's all powerful, he could create any evil, absolute evil. He could create what the Christians call a dualist system. We have God and you have the Son, which they took from other ancient religions. No, since God is absolutely good, he can only do good. Now, sometimes doing good means creating evil for the sake of a greater good. That can be a good thing to do when it's necessary. I gave you the example of inoculations. You can read about this in history books. When I was a child and we got inoculated against diseases, they used big needles, and they were very, very painful. The pills weren't invented yet. So the doctor is immunizing through an action that causes terrible pain. That doesn't mean the doctor's morals are compromised because he's causing pain to children. That was the only way to immunize them. The doctor's character is wholly good, even though he does something which is evil. The pain is evil. The proof that it's evil is that next year when they invent the pill, you don't expect him to use the needle. If he does, you put him in jail. So the needle must be bad. It's just a necessary. So it doesn't compromise God's goodness if he creates evil when the evil is necessary for the sake of that ultimate good. But then it's got to be only that which is necessary for the sake of the ultimate good. So the translation here makes it sound like, yeah, we could accept the proposition that God creates absolute evil. No, we cannot. Because that would compromise God's perfection and God's goodness. If it's a question of power, no, he doesn't lack the power, but he lacks the motivation. He lacks the character to do such a thing. Now, yeah.
Does this fit into the, I believe it was like a Greek idea of, is it good because the divine likes it, or does the divine like it because it's good?
Yeah, you're talking about the Euthyphro problem. It's peripheral. It's peripheral. But maybe, since you asked it, I will say something about it, because it's a clever problem, and I think the Jewish answer, here's the problem. They have, of course, had a polytheistic system. They had many gods, and it was part of their belief system that the gods love the good. And the question was, do the gods love the good because it's good? Or is the good good because the gods love it? What's the cause and what's the effect? What comes first and what comes as a consequence? And each answer is difficult. Whichever answer you pick, the situation is difficult. If you say that it's because the gods love it that it's good, what happens if they love murder? What happens if they love torture? Do murder and torture become good? It's a hard thing to say. On the other hand, if you say that they love it because it's good, then it turns out that the good is the good is the good even if there were no gods. The gods have no hand in creating the good. And the gods are moral, so they love the good because it's good, just as we should. That seems, even to them it seemed, a weakness in the picture of the gods. For us it would be a very difficult thing to accept, that the creator of the universe has no hand in determining what's right and wrong, what's good and evil. Now, you may remember my doing this on other occasions. I think both answers are wrong, and they're wrong roughly for the reasons that are given. I think there's a third answer. The situation is a compound situation. It's not a simple situation. Our sources tell us that we are created in such a way that we know good and evil. Maimonides says this in the 5th chapter of the Laws of Repentance. And others say it as well. But knowing good and evil has to be explained. In particular, let's take the fact that up to about 150 years ago, it was universal medical practice when a person had a fever to bleed him or her. That means to reduce their blood supply. Use leeches or suction cups. From ancient times, that was regarded as an appropriate way to deal with fevers. Since the last 150 years, we haven't done that anymore because we discovered that it's not good for your health, actually. Not in those cases. There are other cases, yes, but not in those cases. So now, what's the difference? Did the doctors 200 years ago know what's good health? Well, yes and no. I mean, they were dedicated to the good. They wanted to treat their patients so as to improve their health. But they didn't know the facts about what, in truth, really helps their medical situation and what doesn't. You can fail to know good and evil in two different ways. You can fail to know the principles, or you can fail to know the actual decisions that you make on the grounds that you don't know the actual facts of the decision. The change in medical practice was a change in medical facts. It wasn't a change in values. This makes a gigantic difference. When you see another society that behaves in a way very different from yours, should you conclude that they have different values from yours? Maybe not. It depends upon their facts. Let's take the case which in our historical period is perhaps the most vivid. What about the Nazis? Did the Nazis have different values from the rest of the Western world? They murdered babies, children. They tried to murder whole populations of people. Many of them good people, nice people, moral people, and they murdered them. Does that mean that they had different values?
That was something that's happened throughout the course of history.
I'm sorry, say again?
What they've done was something that has happened through the course of history.
Happened to the course of history?
Through the course of history.
Okay, well, how's that relevant to my question? I only asked whether they have different values from
But
us.
that wouldn't make them any different than other societies or civilizations throughout time.
I didn't ask that question. I asked whether their values are different from those of the rest of the contemporary Western world. I wasn't asking about ancient Greece or ancient Rome. I'm asking whether that makes their values different from the contemporary Western world. And from the way I'm asking my question, you understand I'm going to say no. So I'm happy, let's discuss it for a little bit, but think carefully if you can maybe anticipate why I'm going to say no. Yeah, in the back.
Well, they didn't really value all life. They have some sort of hierarchy that they build. They're like, right?
Which, well, so you say, but if that's true, and you feel that in the Western world we value life indiscriminately, then you're answering, yes, they did have different values. That's the answer that you're proposing. Yeah.
I thought we said, Rabbi, that we can't define values that they had like other cultural values. Like value is a very generic term. What does it mean that their values are different? Like,
Okay, I'm not going that route. I don't think it's a valid route. We can talk about values. We can definitely discuss values. Right? You can, yeah.
I remember hearing it. I don't have a source for this, so excuse me if I'm wrong. But I remember hearing a quote by Hitler, basically saying that the biggest folly of the Jew is that we have morality, and essentially implying that he does not believe in morality. He only believed in strength and weakness, and good, like ego, essentially, good for the self. So I'd say that that is a rejection of a moral compass altogether.
Yeah, but I didn't ask whether there's one person who had different values. I asked whether the Nazi movement had different values. And I can guarantee you that of the millions of Nazis, there may be 3 who subscribe to that proposition, and not the rest, and I'll prove it to you. I'll prove it to you.
Yeah, majority of it was out of empathy for the German people. And
Well, even more than that, yeah?
So I was thinking, if you say that the Germans valued their state and the well-being of Germany over people, then they have different values. But if you say that the Germans were brainwashed into thinking that the Jews aren't even people, then they were misinformed and they had the same values, but they were seeing it the wrong way.
Hear what he's saying. I'm going to go the same general route, but not in this particular specific. But he's saying if they were brainwashed to look at the facts differently, then the values may not be different. If they're brainwashed to look at the facts differently, that's how you get people to do different things much easier than converting their values. Just brainwash them to think that the facts are different. I happen to know how they actually did it, and you know too, but you're not using it in this thing. Yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, we probably even had the Jews probably even had some of the same values. I mean, you mentioned we have this idea that if somebody's coming to kill you, you kill them first.
Yes, go ahead.
They thought that the Jews were going to kill them. Maybe not, actually murder all of the Germans the way that they tried to murder all the Jews, but by destroying their pure bloodline.
Taking their job.
Okay, the bloodline. Yes, that's true. That's true. But what other stories did the Nazis make up about Jews? They control the finances of the world. They control the press of the world. They're under the table. They're paying politicians and they're trying to take over the world. Why did they make up the story? Why did they bother? Why didn't they simply say Jews are good people, they're nice people, they're moral people, and we kill them anyway? Because we kill nice people. That's what we do. No apologies. They didn't do that because it's very difficult to motivate people to go against their values. So you tell them a story that we're the victims. They're going to trample all over us. And this is old, 200 years in Germany. You had books written about how the Jews are going to take over and trample on all the Germans. Right? They made up that story so they could engage their old values, because the old values are still there. What you said is exactly what the European settlers said about the Native Americans. Oh, you're not supposed to say that anymore. Indigenous peoples, okay. Right. Redskin means you're not human. You're just another kind of animal. I can't take another person's land. No one could do that if he's a person. But if the Redskin, he's not a person. That's why we can take their land. When you need to make up a story like that, that's a symptom that you're using the old values. You're not changing values. Otherwise, you wouldn't make the story up. Very difficult to transform values quickly, and it's very difficult to, indeed, the myth of the Jews attacking and undermining the world was an excuse to use your conscience to kill them. If you go with Hitler, you can't use that because he doesn't believe in the conscience either. Then it's free. It's just a free for all. That's not the way they did it. They did it by demonizing the Jew. And they weren't the first to do this. The Christians did it as well. It was a long-standing historical thing. But if you have to demonize the other side or dehumanize the other side, that means you're using the old values. Yeah.
So does that mean even in the case of modern day terrorists and in the case of Hitler, all these people, that means that there's the general population has the same values, but it's just a few people that don't have the same values that try to control. So like Hitler and the leaders of the terrorists, they don't have that are brainwashing the terrorists. They don't have the same values as us.
No, I think in the case of Hitler, it's an accident. I think the people who are leading, let's say the suicide bombers, they really believe what they're doing.
Right.
But you see, believing doesn't get you a free ticket.
Right.
The question is why you believe it. Whether you're prejudiced in arriving at your belief, whether you're sensitive to the evidence and the counterclaims and how they should be adjudicated, whether you close your mind to any other possibilities, right? And then you can be held responsible.
So how do you account for like Hitler and the people that are brainwashing them, knowing well that the Jews aren't doing this, but they're brainwashing the other people in order for them to use their conscience to kill Jews?
Either that because they wanted Lebensraum for their state, or they believed in the genetic theory of race, and they couldn't sell that to everybody. And you want to motivate a population. You don't just one motivation. You want to get everybody in. So you try various different things to work it in. But the vast majority felt they were defending their country against an existential threat, and that's why they were using the old values. Okay, so now, I know we got to that. Yes, so then we're going to talk about the Euthyphro, right? So now, this I believe is the Jewish position on this subject. Imagine a situation like this. You are given, by your very nature, you're given the disposition to develop moral principles on the basis of normal experience. The Rambam is very careful about this. You're not born with anything. You're not born knowing anything. You're not born with any values. It's not genetic. The genes program you so that when you have certain experiences, you'll respond by accepting certain propositions. The Gemara talks about it. The Gemara says that if the Torah had not been given, we would learn privacy from the cat and we would learn industry from the ant. Why wouldn't we have learned sloth from the sloth, which sleeps 17 hours a day in Australia? Who says, well, we would learn? The Talmud is making a very important point, which was only recognized generally in the middle of the 20th century. Noam Chomsky was a big advocate of this, that you are genetically prepared to respond to certain experiences in a particular way. You're not learning it from experience. The experiences trigger this response in you. That's the way you understand linguistic ability. So the Talmud is saying, if you look at the sloth sleeping all day, you look at it and you respond, that's awful. Even if the lands were plentiful with the produce, and you didn't need to do work, but sleeping your life away looks degraded. And privacy also looks like an elevated way to live, rather than the way other animals live. So, we are programmed to undergo, when we undergo normal human experiences, to develop certain moral rules. But developing moral rules doesn't yet dictate what we have to do. You have to apply the rules to the real world. And if you don't know key facts about the real world, then your application of the rules to the world will be drastically off base. Well, let's see. One of the really very important things about the world is that there's a creator. That's a pretty important fundamental idea. And not only the creator is not a deist, God who created the world and went on vacation, but he is managing the world continuously, and he has communicated with people, interacted with people, and he did it for a certain purpose, and the purpose is the greatest good that any human being could possibly possess, both individually and collectively. If you know that, then your decisions about moral items, moral desiderata, moral requirements, are going to be very vastly affected by that. So, for example, God benefits us in gigantic ways. There's a moral principle of repaying gratitude. If George is drowning in the river, Peter saves his life. And George is grateful. And then a week later, Peter and a neighbor both asked George for a loan. And George says, gee, I only have enough money for one loan, so I'll flip a coin. George is criminal. Peter saved his life. The other guy's a neighbor. You owe compensation, you owe gratitude to the one who saved your life. That's a moral requirement, gratitude. That moral requirement is a principle that is not derived from the Torah. That's an independent moral principle. In fact, some of our sources say that this is one of the key motivations for accepting the whole system, is gratitude to God. If you're looking for a motivation to accept the whole system, then you're standing outside and you're saying, here's the system with all of its rules. How should I relate to it? Answer, accept it. Why? Because of gratitude. You say, well, why should I acknowledge gratitude? Because the system says so. Sorry, that's reasoning in a circle. Right? That won't get you anywhere. You've got to have an independent reason to pay debts of gratitude and use that as your motivation for accepting the system. So the moral principle of paying debts of gratitude is a general principle and applies wherever it applies. To your parents, to your teachers, the people who lend you money, to your sports coach. It applies wherever it applies. In addition to applying in all those cases, it also applies to God. If you ask the measure of gratitude, the measure of gift that I'm repaying, God's gift is enormously greater than the gift of the other people. Doesn't eliminate it, doesn't validate it, but it's enormously greater. Now imagine that God says, here's something I want from you, a half hour every morning with leather boxes and leather straps. Half hour every morning. So I think, let's see, a half hour every morning. Boy, that's tough. Let's see. What do I owe God? Well, my existence, my health, my intelligence, all my resources, the stability of the world in which I operate. Is that equal in quantity to a half hour in the morning with leather boxes? Now, if I'm an American, I don't know. After all, a half hour is a long time, and who knows, But if you're from another country where you think of things in less defensive terms, you think a half hour with boxes is probably within the limits of the debt. So gratitude requires me to put on tefillin because of a two-step argument. Step one is God creates and sustains the world, which creates a debt of gratitude. Step two is He told me to put on tefillin. The result of both of those steps is that I'm morally obligated to put on tefillin because of the moral obligation I have to God, because of gratitude. So here's how we're working with the Euthyphro problem. Is the good because the gods love it? Is the gods love the good because it's good? Well, the good is good on its own, that is to say that moral principles are. They're not good because God said so. They're not good because God commanded us to do them. Of course, He creates the world. But their goodness stands independently of God's saying that we should do it, authorizing that we should do it. We know it, and we know it in such a way that were there no God and we were constituted in the same way, we would know what's good and evil without it. But on the other hand, the moral principles that we have imply a moral authority to God, and when He uses that moral authority, then certain things become right and good because He said so. So He's not irrelevant to morality. The principles are independent, and yet He's not irrelevant because He triggers the activity of those principles on the basis of how He relates to the world. I'll give you one more example. Property rights, which we recognize, give a person certain privileges, certain authority over the things that are his property. I'm not going to talk about absolute authority. I'm not going to talk about absolute rights across the board, but certain things we all acknowledge can be owned, like pieces of land, like animals, like trees, like airspace. Ideas is tricky, and so on and so on. People is tricky. I'm not going to go there. I don't need to go there. Now, what makes a person an owner is also something that's discussed in detail in various political philosophy sources. But one thing's for sure. If you create something out of nothing, you just make it exist with no prior input, you certainly own it. That's for sure, you own it. Again, leaving people aside. So now, let's imagine God says to Jews, you can't eat pigs. Translation, they're my pigs. And I'm telling you, I don't give you permission to eat them. So if a Jew eats a pig, he's stealing. A Jew eats a pig, he's immoral. I'm stressing this because I grew up in the Reform movement in the United States, and one of the things they stressed there, that there are two types of commandments, moral commandments and ritual commandments. And moral commandments are important because if you violate a moral commandment, then I guess you're not moral. That's not good. But if you violate a ritual commandment, then you're just not a ritual. So, sort of take it or leave it. That's not really important. What we're discovering now is that all the commandments are moral. Because we have a moral relationship to God, which they left out of the picture. And he's the owner of the world. He has the moral authority of an owner to tell you what you can do with his world. Again, there are limits. We do believe there are limits. But within the limits, these are real obligations. So when you ask, what should I do in practice? What actions in the world are good and right and just and so forth and so on? You realize that you have to have two inputs to answer that question. One input is your moral principles, and the other is the relevant facts. God's existence and what he does for the world is a relevant fact. And that relevant fact is going to trigger the principles in a particular way to get to certain conclusions. So, on the one hand, the principles are independent. On the other hand, God is not irrelevant to morality. God's will is very relevant to morality because it triggers the application of certain moral principles. Yeah.
I have a question. You might have covered it, but it might have went over my head. How are they independent if God created everything? He created good and bad, so God exists above good and bad. So how are they independent of Hashem if Hashem created good? So Hashem can't be good or bad because he created it.
Okay, so now you're asking two different questions. Whether he can be good or bad because he created, that's something separate. But the question is, I said it's independent. You're right to ask the question. There are two senses of independence here, and I didn't define them carefully because I didn't do everything in one shot. One sense of independence is that it exists without God creating it. That's off the books. That's off the books. From our point of view, God creates everything. So in that respect, you're absolutely right. But the other sense of independent is whether you need to appeal to God's authority to know that it's good or right. Imagine a person who goes into I'm here for 41 years. There was a time when people went into the store and they bought things. The guy totaled it up on a piece of paper and said, that's what you owe. So you're there and he totals it up and you look at the thing and say, hey, you made a mistake here. You made a mistake in the addition. And the storekeeper looks at it and says, oh, you're absolutely right. Thank you for pointing it out. I'll change the bill. And then he says to the customer, by the way, do you believe in God? The customer says, no, not really. Well, how can you use arithmetic? Arithmetic is God's creation. Who gave you the right to use it if you don't believe in God? That's, I hope you understand, a wrong question. The right answer is, whether you believe in God or not, arithmetic stands alone. It has its own validity. You don't need to appeal to a verse in Genesis to justify that 2 + 2 is 4. Justification is self-contained. So when it's independent of an appeal to God to justify using it, I don't have to say that the obligation to pay debts of gratitude is a real obligation, and it's required of you to obey by it on the grounds that God said so. On the contrary, we said if I had to use those grounds, I could never use it as a reason for accepting the system. So it's independent in terms of justification, and that's the crucial issue here. I think
Neshama could determine on its own based on experience.
So
That's why it's
you come. This is a difficult field. The basis of ethics is a difficult field. One strain of contemporary thought is that the principles of ethics are very much like the principles of mathematics. Right? You believe 2 + 2 is 4 because your experience, in a certain sense, triggers you to develop that idea that it's so. You don't learn it from experience. It's not like gravity. But your experience triggers your understanding that it is so. And the same is true with moral. I'll give you an example of 2 + 2 = 4, and then I'll be finished for today. We're covering a lot of ground. Then we have to next 2 days. Suppose somebody, actually John Stuart Mill actually said this. 2 plus 2 is 4, you're convinced of that because it happens every time, that's all. You're just used to it. It happens so often you can't even imagine it being different, but it's just because you've seen it happen consistently so many times, that's where you get 2 plus 2 equals 4 from. Well, other philosophers laughed him out of the room for that, and here's an example why. You've gotten used to 2 plus 2 is 4 because it's always been that way in your experience, but not in my bag. In my bag, 2 plus 2 is 3. It's not 4, it's 3. I'll show you. Give me 2 apples, I put them in my bag. Give me another 2 apples, put them in my bag. I shake the bag up and I open up. 3 apples come out of the table. There are all your apples. They're all there. Because in my bag, 2 plus 2 is 3. See? So it's not always true that 2 plus 2 is 4. Sometimes it's 3. Right? Are you going to buy that? Are you going to consider that as a possibility? Maybe you should try it with the bag. No, maybe you could look for a hidden hole in the bag. No, maybe his bag 2 plus 2 is 3. And I got back all my apples. I don't think you're going to take that seriously. Now let's try gravity. Unsupported heavy objects fall towards the earth. Everybody's seen that with no exceptions. With hurricanes and stuff of the sort, those are exceptions that you could define. Right? That's it. Not over here. Over here, here's a 1 kilogram weight. Watch. I let go and it just sits there. Wow, that's strange. How come it's not falling to the ground? She said, okay, there's some hidden thing supporting. There's a stream that I don't see that's holding up. Maybe it's magnetic, it's over the sun. You pull in the physics department of Stanford University. They do an exhaustive search. They can't find any physical explanation. Maybe gravity doesn't work here. After all, you only know gravity from experience. You only know it from experience. When you only know it from experience, then you're prepared to say, maybe sometimes it doesn't work. Experiments have been going on like this by the astronomers for decades. Maybe in distant space, gravity works differently. The constants of gravity is different. We didn't see it, but maybe out there it is different. Because you learned it from experience, you can tolerate the idea that maybe someplace else that I haven't looked yet will be different. 2 plus 2 is 4 is not like that. You're not going to tolerate that under any, 2 plus 2 is 3. You're not going to tolerate that under any conditions. 2 plus 2 is 4 is a principle we use to regulate reality. We don't learn it from our experience. Now, as I said before, we are pre-programmed genetically that when you have certain experiences, you'll come to appreciate this. But what you come to appreciate is not, gee, it happened to my mother and my aunt and my uncle, so therefore it's got to be right. What you appreciate is that here's a principle, and this principle is what governs how reality works. So if mathematics has this character, no one can say definitively that ethics can't have the same character. As I say, this is a difficult subject, and this is one strain in what I consider to be the best philosophers in the last 50 years. So that's what the moral principles are like. Your experience teaches you that these are the principles by which a person ought to live, and that's not, you're not relying on God's authority to know that these principles are that way. And Maimonides says this word for word in the 5th chapter of the Laws of Repentance. I'm not making this up. Not a modern philosophical idea. It's an old Jewish idea. But then to know what to do in a concrete case, since there is a creator and he's running the world, his word is going to be very, very important in determining what should be done in a concrete case. And I said several times that there are limitations. Maybe we'll talk about this tomorrow. Think of when God tells Abraham, Sodom and Gomorrah are going down the tubes. What does Abraham do? He argues very aggressively that you can't kill the righteous and please have mercy on the wicked. Argues with God and says, you're proposing to kill the righteous, what you're doing is wrong. That means you can argue with God on morality. That's pretty striking. But that's an illustration of what I've been telling you. I'll pick it up there tomorrow.